Hello, everyone. Welcome both here in Glasgow and online. Hi, guys. To this intergenerational dialogue on research in climate intervention with SilverLining and some truly amazing youth climate organisations who our panellists are representing today. That's Sustenta Honduras, Green Africa Youth Organisation, and Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar. So my name is Madeleine Carlsberg-Schaefer. I'm a research fellow at SilverLining and also the coordinator of the organisation's Global Youth Initiative. I'm originally from Edinburgh, which is about an hour train ride this way. And now I'm based in Amsterdam, where I'm following a 2-year master's in governance of sustainability at Leiden University. But funnily enough, I also attended the University of Glasgow for my bachelor's, so it feels really cool to be doing this event in a city where I first learned about climate intervention. I actually have one of my classmates where that actually happened quite a few years back. So it's come full circle a little bit. I'm joined here by Arushi Shah, my wonderful co-host and colleague. She's just been signing you all in. We're really excited to be here and to get started. But before we do that, we just wanted to have, a few minutes to contextualize. Why are we here? Why are we having this kind of conversation? Well, as many of you know, the youth environmental movement has become a serious, if not one of the biggest, sources of momentum for action. And young people have taken the lead in creating tangible change around the globe in combating climate change. Both ironically, but also perhaps not surprisingly, the world is now looking to us, to our generation, to help lead humanity of the mess that we now find ourselves in. And young people have demanded, quite rightly, that we deserve a seat at the table. This is an intergenerational justice issue, after all. And yes, finally, there are indeed signs that that's happening. For example, last summer, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he set up the Youth Advisory Group on climate change. That's the highest position in the UN with a Youth Advisory Board on climate change. So this is, of course, notable progress. But why we're here today is because while we have taken these kinds of steps in the right direction, with young people now holding leading roles in enacting change on emissions mitigation, climate adaptation, conservation, circular economy, etc., and with greater youth inclusion across the climate arena, we are, however, largely absent, on policy dialogues on climate intervention. Apart from us at this event today, to my knowledge, to Rushi's knowledge, I think you could probably agree with me, we are the only event on climate intervention that centres young people and young people's voices. Meanwhile, there are probably thousands of events across the entirety of these 2 weeks, perhaps at best hundreds, with a focus on youth, or at least with some level of youth participation. But other than us here today, there are zero on climate intervention, with young people weighing into the dialogue, weighing into the debate, and being included as a key stakeholder. This is, of course, partly an awareness issue, for sure, but it also comes down to the fact that we are facing the same kinds of problems that other sectors of the climate crisis have experienced and are experiencing. Youth are not being included in this conversation, and this is a critical conversation like the others, an absolutely critical one. So here we are taking that step forward and trying to initiate that change. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Arushi for the first session.
Hello, everyone. As Maddie said, I'm Arushi. I'm also one of the research fellows at SilverLining. I'm currently pursuing my undergraduate education at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and I'm studying science, technology, and international affairs. So this is also a very full circle moment for me because it's all coming together, everything I studied. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today. And without further ado, let's get into our first section of the day. We're going to be first discussing some of the different climate interventions out there, and we're going to be focusing specifically on marine cloud brightening. We're going to be joined by Sarah. Sarah Dorothy is the program director of the Marine Cloud Brightening program at the University of Washington. She's also an associate adjunct professor of atmospheric sciences at the Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies. Her research to date has primarily focused on measurements of atmospheric aerosol optical properties, with a strong emphasis on instrument development and improvement of measurement techniques and field campaigns. She is also one of the lead authors on the 2017 U.S. National Climate Assessment, and she is currently assessment coordinator for the 2022 Scientific Assessment of Ozone Depletion.
Hi, Arushi. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, Sarah, it's nice to have you. So, Sarah, you have some really, really interesting things in your background, like working on a research camp in Antarctica. So can you tell us how you came to be working on marine cloud brightening specifically?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to get to work for the U.S. Antarctic program for a year, and I was running instruments to measure things having to do mostly with the ozone hole. So that got me quite interested in how the atmosphere works and in atmospheric sciences, which led me to go back to school and get a graduate degree in atmospheric sciences, get my PhD in atmospheric sciences. And I went on from there to continue to do a lot of instrument work and do measurements in the atmosphere, but focusing on particulate pollution in the atmosphere and how it interacts with sunlight to affect climate, and then how those particles interact with clouds to affect climate. So working on marine cloud brightening was a pretty natural extension of that, because it's all about how particles can be used to increase the reflectivity of clouds to hopefully slow climate warming.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Sarah. So can you tell us some more about what are some of the climate interventions that scientists might be thinking about today that may be able to reduce warming, and why specifically are they thinking about this now?
There are multiple mechanisms that are being discussed for trying to slow climate warming through intentional climate intervention. One of the most prominent, most of them have to do with increasing the amount of sunlight that's reflected from the Earth, where greenhouse gases are retaining infrared radiation and making things warmer. This would be trying to offset that by increasing the amount of sunlight that's reflected. So one of the ways you could do that would be to put small particles in the stratosphere, which is the next layer up in the atmosphere from the troposphere where we live. And those particles would get distributed around the globe pretty evenly and reflect sunlight back to space and cool climate. And that basically is mimicking what happens after a volcanic eruption. If you have a powerful volcanic eruption, you end up with particles getting injected into the stratosphere where they have a longer lifetime. They stay up there for about a year or two, versus if they were in the lower part of the atmosphere where they would only remain for a few days. So that's one mechanism. It's called stratospheric aerosol injection. Another thing you could do would be put up what's called a sunshade, basically put a partially reflective surface up in space between the sun and the Earth. That's less discussed. SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, is the most common one you hear about. And then the next most common one is marine cloud brightening, which is what I'm working on. And that will be to try and increase the reflectivity of a specific type of clouds over the ocean, also to increase the sunlight reflection back to space and cool climate.
So there are a lot of ways for climate intervention, but can you tell us more specifically about how marine cloud brightening works? For someone who isn't very technically educated, I would love to have a little brief overview of that. And what is your program exactly doing to understand it better?
I mentioned that I study particles in the atmosphere. And so something you may not know is that clouds, all the droplets in clouds all form on particles, which is how you segue from studying particles to studying clouds. So all those clouds that you see up there, every droplet in them is formed on a particle in the atmosphere. And so the number of particles in the atmosphere will affect the cloud and how it forms and how those droplets form. The idea behind marine cloud brightening is that you would take small particles of sea salt from the ocean and add them to the clouds in a marine environment, so that you would go from having a small number of particles in the atmosphere, sea salt particles in the atmosphere, to having a large number of sea salt particles in the atmosphere. And what would happen then is that the water that's going to condense down onto a cloud would be condensing down, onto a larger number of particles. So you would go from a cloud that has a small number of large droplets to having a cloud that has a large number of small droplets. And that basically increases the surface area of water in the clouds and makes the cloud more reflective. So that's the basic concept behind marine cloud brightening. And the idea for this came from seeing satellite images of this actually happening basically unintentionally. So this is a satellite view over the United States Pacific Northwest with the big stratocumulus cloud deck off the west coast of North America. And you can see these bright streaks in the clouds, and they kind of look like aircraft contrails, but they're not. They're actually brightened areas of clouds from where cargo ships have been going underneath those clouds, emitting particles from their engines, just from burning fossil fuel. Those particles get mixed into the clouds, and the process that I was just describing is what happens. You go from having clouds with a small number of particles that have large droplets to having a large number of particles with small droplets, and that produces these bright streaks in the clouds. So people saw this in satellite images and saw, the cloud brightening effect and thought, well, maybe we could do this intentionally, but instead of doing it with, pollution from cargo ships that's unintentional and uncontrolled, we could perhaps do it with sea salt, which is already present in the marine environment and is natural, particle, and try and do this intentionally as a way of slowing climate warming while we're reducing the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So that's the basic concept and where it came from. So I just showed you an image where you can see that this is, brightening clouds is something that we're actually already doing unintentionally. And I showed you a very visible example from cargo ships. But we're doing this more generally with the pollution that we emit into the atmosphere. So when we produce particulate emission in the atmosphere, particulate emissions, they end up in the atmosphere, and some of those mix into clouds. So what you can see here is a bar graph of all the ways that humans are forcing climate change or are driving climate change. And at the top, those red bars are the greenhouse gases, which drive climate warming. Down lower on the graph, you can see these blue bars, which are the effects of aerosols, which are small particles, the particles in the atmosphere. And they produce cooling by directly scattering sunlight back to space, and also by interacting with clouds and making the clouds more reflective. So this process, which is already happening through inadvertent production of particulate pollution, is offsetting. You can see that these blue bars are offsetting about a third of the warming from greenhouse gases. So we're already doing this at a scale that's offsetting a third of greenhouse gas warming. The other thing you can see from this graph is that these error bars on these blue bars are really large. And that's telling you that there's really big uncertainty in these processes and in how these particles, how much sunlight they reflect back to space, basically. And it turns out that these particles and their interactions with clouds have for a long time and continue to contribute the largest uncertainty in how humans are forcing climate change or driving climate change. So this is something that as a community we've been working on studying regardless of the marine cloud brightening problem. We've been working on trying to understand how particulate pollution affects cloud reflectivity in the interest of understanding climate change. So as I mentioned, if we tried to do this intentionally instead of inadvertently in a more controlled way using sea salt, the idea is that we would have some thousands of ships out at sea, each of which would spray a very large number of very, very small particles into specific regions of low marine clouds, and that their first order estimates that if you did this, you could reduce a significant amount of the warming from greenhouse gases. There are very, very specific types of clouds that would be amenable to brightening. And these are clouds mostly over the ocean. And there's specifically clouds called stratocumulus clouds, which cover about a fifth of the ocean surface. And the areas where they're most prevalent and persistent are these four areas that I've circled in orange here. You can see off the west coasts of North America, South America, and Southern Africa. So these are the regions that we're most likely to target with marine cloud brightening. So you would do this in specific areas. So you would implement this in specific areas But it turns out these are results from a global model, that even if you do this only in specific areas, like where these black circles are showing, which correspond to the circles in the previous graph, you get actually global scale cooling. So the colors in the map show the temperature change that you get from introducing marine cloud brightening just in those black circled regions. So even though it would be locally implemented, because temperature and heat is transported very rapidly in the atmosphere and also through the ocean, the cooling effect actually ends up getting distributed globally. Now, this is just one global climate model run, so this isn't to say this is exactly what would happen, but it gives you the idea that you would get global cooling if you implemented marine cloud brightening at scale, even in these 3 regions. So what are the big questions that we're working on on marine cloud brightening? Well, there's still a question about the feasibility of doing this. Can we generate these sea salt particles at the required scale and of the right size and the right concentration? So there's a technical question there. And then, what size particles do we need? And this is a question that relates to what would be the effect on marine clouds under various conditions? How much brightening could you actually achieve under different meteorological conditions with different cloud fields using different sizes and concentrations of injected sea salt and making different assumptions about what the background particle distribution looks like? And then given how much brightening you could get from the clouds, how much cooling could you produce using marine cloud brightening at a global scale? So how much of climate warming could you offset with marine cloud brightening? And then, of course, the really important question of, if you did this, if you accomplished this goal of brightening marine clouds and cooling climate, what would be the full suite of impacts that you would have on the climate, on ecosystems, on human systems? So this is the scope of questions that we're trying to address through the Marine Cloud Brightening Project. And we're hoping that the answers to this would be passed on then to policymakers who could make decisions about whether this is something you would want to use, in addition to, of course, mitigation, adaptation, possibly carbon sequestration. So the process that I showed you at the beginning, this idea of, you have clouds with not many particles, you add more particles to them, it makes them brighter. That seems fairly simple and straightforward. This is called the Tumi Effect, because the person who figured it out is named Tumi. And so that concept is fairly basic. Where all the difficulty comes in is, it turns out it's not that simple. So next slide. It turns out that if you do this, if you add particles to clouds so they have more small droplets, there are other things that then happen. So you can imagine that if you have smaller droplets, that cloud will be less likely to start raining, because the droplets need to get to a certain size before they start falling out of the sky. So that would retain cloud water and make the clouds last longer, which would even increase more the amount of brightening that you get. But the other thing that can happen is the particles, the droplets, are smaller at the top of the cloud, and that can make them more likely to evaporate. If they're more likely to evaporate, then you lose cloud water, makes the cloud less reflective. So these are two opposing, possible things that could happen. There's a suite of other things as well that have to do with how these smaller droplets change the dynamics in the cloud. But I think you get the idea that there's a whole bunch of what we call cloud adjustments that happen after you end up with smaller droplets. And that's really where a lot of our work is trying to figure out what those cloud adjustments would look like, what the full suite of impacts on the clouds would be, and therefore how much brightening you would end up getting or dimming you would getting under different circumstances. So to understand all this, all of these processes and how they play out, we are using a mix of climate simulations, high-resolution simulations, observations from satellites, observations from the ground, and eventually what we would want to do is go out and do experiments to test these processes, to test things at this scale and check and see that our model simulations are representing things properly. And so it will be really through analysis of all 3 of these simulations, observations, and going out and doing actual perturbation experiments at a small scale with clouds that we would come to understand how all these cloud adjustments play out. So a lot of the work that we're doing is with simulations right now, using really high resolution models. These 2 images are from our model. The picture on the right you can see is like a 3-dimensional image from the model. The white and gray part is the clouds. The colored surface is the temperature of the sea surface. and then the yellow streaks are rainfall. So you can see that it produces really realistic cloud fields. The image on the left is looking down from above at that same field and looking at how the reflectivity of the cloud varies over the different parts of that cloud field. So that's just to give you a feel for what it looks like when we do these very high resolution simulations to try and understand all these cloud processes. So this one actually has an animation on it. If you could hit play on the animation, if that's possible. See if that works, but just to give you an idea, the type of things, there we go. The type of things we're looking at are on the top panel. Do we actually get an increase in the number of droplets in the cloud when you inject aerosol, like you can see happening there? How does the cloud liquid water amount change in response? That's the middle panel. And then, of course, the variable of interest, how does the cloud reflectivity change when you add these particles, which is in the bottom panel. And you can see just to the right of the -5 kilometers, you can see a brighter streak, and that's where the particles were added. So this is one simulation for a specific set of conditions, and we're trying to do a whole lot of simulations like this using different conditions, different sea salt particle size distributions and concentrations, and seeing how they play out. So following on that, we're doing all these simulations. We're going to do them under a whole range of different conditions and try and understand how the system works and what the responses might look like under different conditions. And then what we really need to do, because none of these models are perfect, is to go out and do field experiments where we look at how clouds actually respond to the addition of these sea salt particles. And this is something we know how to do quite well. This is, like I said, this is adding, particulate pollution has been affecting cloud reflectivity for years now, and we've been trying to understand that and quantify it. So this is an example of just images from a field experiment, one of many that I've been involved with, and there's been many around the globe, looking at particles and how they interact with clouds. And in these cases, what we're doing is sort of passively observing the system. The particles have already mixed in with the clouds. We don't really have a good control case to look at to be able to say what would those clouds look like if there wasn't pollution mixed into them. So we try and deconvolve all that, and it can be difficult because oftentimes the things that drive whether or not those pollution particles mix into the clouds also change the cloud properties themselves. So there's been a lot of work in this area, but we've had a really difficult time disentangling when you have cloud changes driven by the particles versus when you have cloud changes just driven by the meteorology changes.
Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Hello,
I'm very glad to be here.
It's so nice to have you. I know we have a short video clip to show, so if we could pull that up, that would be great, and we'll get right back to you. And thank you for that very informative presentation, Sarah.
So this is the setup that we are working on to be able to produce these tiny, tiny droplets that will carry the salt, the crystal salt, that will work as the cloud condensation nuclei. So this is the nozzle. Mm-hmm. The pressure chamber, it's right here. It's where the two flows, they will meet each other. The air is coming through this side, and brine is coming through this side here. So this guy here is what helps us to pressurize the brine. Then after that, we have the air side. Once we calibrate the water, we calibrate the air, and then we release the nozzle. Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. Once again, it's so great to have you here. Jessica is a researcher at the Palo Alto Research Center, as we just saw, and she's also a PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego, with a focus on transport phenomena involving water. She is one of the primary researchers developing a spray system for generating sea salt mist for marine cloud brightening, like we just saw in the video. So Jessica, tell us a bit more about what we just saw, what's involved in actually developing this technology.
Yeah, so what we just saw was the effervescent spray system that we are developing here at Park, that we are engineering the system to produce those little, like very tiny particles, and a lot of them per second, which is a very difficult task to do. So we need to engineer the inner parts of those systems, like to actually take full advantage of the fluid flow, the dynamics that is going on there, so we can deliver this amount of particles at this scale.
I'm sure there's a lot of technicalities to keep in mind. So how high do you actually have to spray these particles, and how would you potentially get it there?
Yeah, so we already know that particles, sea salts working as the CNs or cloud condensation nuclei, some of them are produced naturally in the ocean by breaking waves or bubble bursting in the ocean. What we want to do is to boost or to accelerate this process in certain marine regions. So once those particles are ejected, due to convective motion in the atmosphere, the winds and all the circular movement of the air, they will bring those particles up to 2 kilometers above, or from 1 to 2 kilometers above, which is the cloud layer. So right now, it's much more important to us to know how far these particles that we eject can spread over any horizontal area. Then we will work on climate conditions, wind conditions to have those particles up in the cloud layer.
Thank you for answering that. I'm sure some of us must be wondering that doing this might be like also causing emissions and releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So what is the carbon footprint of actually implementing this technology compared to the amount of cooling it would potentially create?
So, well, we're talking about the amount of energy that we need to generate those particles, right? We might be talking about a tenth of kilowatts to tenth of megawatts. We don't know for certain yet. The good thing is those systems that we have here, we can already produce 90% of the particles eject within the right range. But those few particles, of course, you have to imagine that not all the particles are going to be the same size that are ejected. So the few particles that are large, they still carry a lot of the salt. And this is what we are trying to improve. We are trying to get rid of those large particles so we can have a very efficient system. In terms of carbon footprint, one of our main objectives is to have a system that requires with minimal energy needs. And we are also trying to develop or doing research so we can guarantee that through the entire life cycle of the system, the carbon footprint will be very low. But we are in this stage, so we cannot give numbers right now how much that's going to be. And compared to the offset, that if this technology works and if marine cloud brightening can actually be used as this tool to help us to mitigate global warming effects, the offset of the energy that will be reflected back to the sky, it's a few orders of magnitude than compared to the energy that this system will use.
Thank you. This is such an interesting question and such an interesting problem that you're working on. So tell us a little bit more about how you got here. What was your journey like? How did you end up working on this?
Yeah, so I'm from a generation that grew up learning about the harmful effects from global warming. So I always wanted to work on renewable energy systems. I, in fact, came to the US to study the transport mechanism of energy in hopes of developing technological devices for renewable energy applications. So I could not have asked for a better opportunity other than this one, where I can, as an engineer and a scientist, I can contribute to develop a system that will hopefully work to mitigate the effects of global warming. Not to mention that I'm working side by side with amazing people in this project. So so it was all this. It's fulfilling all my desire of doing something about climate change and global warming, that it's a threat to society.
Thank you so much for answering all my questions, Jessica. If we could bring Sarah back for a short Q&A session, that would be great. Hello, Sarah. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they would like to ask?
Hi, my name is Annabelle. I'm a sustainability student from Amsterdam. Thank you so much for the interesting presentations. I was just wondering, and maybe I missed this part because I was a bit late, sorry. About the parts where it's you use sea spray to essentially kind of thicken the clouds. Does this also impact salinization, for instance, of coastal areas, or that it maybe brings the sea salt to other areas where you maybe don't want it? And I don't really know who to ask, but whoever wants to answer, thanks.
I'd be happy to answer that. So the clouds that we would targeting would mostly be sort of offshore a bit, and the particles that we add to the boundary layer to the marine areas would only last for sort of 2 to 3 days. It would get rained out and settle out go back into the ocean fairly rapidly. So in addition to that, the particles that we would be adding to the clouds would be large in number, but small in size. So we'd only be using the mass of sea salt in the atmosphere by maybe 5, at most 10%. So it's a fairly small increase in the mass of sea salt in the air, and that additional mass wouldn't last very long. So we don't expect that there would be a amount of salt increase, deposited to coastal areas over what already is from the ocean.
Thank you so much for answering.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Anneleen Kenis. I'm a researcher in climate politics, and I wondered whether you have the feeling that people at the conference these weeks are open for these technologies, whether you experience a lot of opposition, whether you understand the opposition, and how you deal with that. Thank you very much.
I'm not there this week, so I'm not sure exactly what the tone is this week at the conference. I, of course, have heard from people who are opposed to studying this. I think it's important to distinguish being opposed to using this, especially right now, versus doing research into whether it even be feasible. So we do a really controversial area. The idea of intentionally going out and changing the climate system is a controversial concept. So we do hear from people on that. My thinking is, I understand the ideological standpoint of we shouldn't intentionally change the climate system. And at the same time, when I started studying climate, it's clear that global warming was something that was possibly in our future. But we had the opportunity at that time to mitigate emissions efficiently to stay within a safe climate regime. One of the things that's motivating me to work on this project is that we're no longer in that place. We absolutely need to reduce emissions. But even with that, the latest IPCC report shows that even if we do take the very drastic emissions reduction steps that we need to take and should take, we're still going to have several decades of significant climate warming. And so I've seen a real change in attitude to the science community about willingness to do research on this problem and consider whether or not this might be something that we would include in a portfolio of response options to climate change down the road, simply because we're now locked into a significant amount of climate warming and potentially a dangerous amount of climate warming for some period of time while we get greenhouse gas concentrations under control. So yes, there are people who are opposed to it on an ideological basis, but I think there's been a definite shift in attitude studying the feasibility of this and knowing whether or not it's something that we have even as an option.
Thank you so much. Maybe a very small question to add to that, because I hear you making a distinction between doing research and deploying the technology, but I wonder, as you mentioned yourself, like all models are wrong, like models are not perfect. They're useful, but they're wrong. Then the question is, like, how can you ever do really kind of final research about the technology without deploying it at the same time? By doing the research, you're actually deploying it. Thank you.
So that latter statement isn't completely true. When we're doing this, so the experiments that I would, for example, would be experiments at a small scale where you would not be affecting climate, but you would be understanding the physical processes that allow you to improve your model, confidence in your models. The second, so we wouldn't be doing experiments that are at the level of implementation. In regarding the models being uncertain, this is true for all climate projections. We're using the same climate models to project the impacts of doing climate intervention as we are for understanding the change. So yes, there's uncertainty, but there's also uncertainty in how climate is going to evolve in the future. And you need to have, the ability to make decisions in the face of uncertainty here, as with many other policy areas. One thing I would sort of point out is that our climate models are tested within using observations, and we only have observations for the climate we've been able to observe. And the further we get away from that climate, the less confidence we can have in the models. So you could argue that we would have larger uncertainty in what climate look like if we let greenhouse gases, become as high as it looks like they're going to, and climate is just allowed to warm along with that. Climate system than we've had in the past and have been able to observe. So the models uncertainty would be higher in that warmer system than it might be if you had those same greenhouse gas levels but reduced warming. Climate intervention. So it's not necessarily the case that there's more uncertainty with climate intervention than without.
Thank you so much. I still have a lot of questions, but I will first give the floor to someone else.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. So thank you so much, Sarah and Jessica. You guys were wonderful, and it was so nice to have you here virtually. I'm not gonna, sorry, we might take questions after, but we're running short on time right now. But I will pass it on to my co-host, Maddie, again.
Thank you, Rishi, and of course, Jessica and Sarah for joining us. I know that was a lot of information, so we'll now have a bit more of a kind of back and forth for this part of the day. It's also the more kind of youth dialogue section. So this is where I'll be introducing our amazing panelists, all young professionals in the climate change space. I just want to say that before I introduce these guys, they are so incredible and so inspiring. I do not have nearly the amount of time I need to fully paint the picture of the kind of work that they do. They are truly like the leading guys in this space. So, and again, if you guys have any questions for them, please keep them in mind as we continue. So first we have Ricardo Pineda Guzman. He's the director and co-founder of Sustenta Honduras, which is a youth climate organization focusing on youth empowerment in projects forwarding action on climate change and sustainable development in his home country of Honduras. He is a climate negotiator for long-term strategies in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for those of you who are maybe not familiar at this point. He has also worked for the Honduran government on the nation's decarbonisation strategy, and he was also named Young Climate Champion and Green Ticket winner by the UN in 2019? Yes, amazing. Next we have Joshua Mponsim. Josh, if you'd like to take the floor. Josh is from Ghana. He is the founder and executive director of Green Africa Youth Organization, which is a leading organization on climate and young people in West Africa and beyond, actually. It's a youth-led organization that has done all sorts of ambitious and successful projects in Ghana and beyond that, ranging from waste management to renewable energy. He also served as an advisor to the UN Youth Envoy's Office in the planning and delivering of the first ever UN Youth Climate Summit back in 2019. And he also supported the establishment of the first ever IRENA Youth Forum. So IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency. We also have Beatrice Caron. If you'd like to come up and join us, Beatrice. She is from Paris, and she's one of the two contact points of Youngo's Technology Mechanism Working Group, which she decided to create with other Youngo members. For those of you who don't know, Youngo is the youth and children's constituency of the UNFCCC. Youngo TechMech allows the development of projects to implement the research and use of climate technologies through webinars or labs. She has an engineering background, and she's at COP today as an observer with Engineers Without Borders. And lastly, joining us online, hopefully we're all set up, from Qatar is Nishad Shafi. Hey Nishad, can you hear us all right? Yeah, fantastic. Nishad co-founded the Arab Youth Climate Movement, Qatar, which is a pioneering youth climate organization in the region. He has contributed actively in international summits, including several previous COPs, the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2019, the World Economic Forum Middle East in 2019 as well, Global Landscapes Forum Bonn 2019, the UN Climate Summit in 2019 in New York, and several others. So thank you for joining us remotely today, Nishad, as well, and to our other guests. So this is, I've got one opening question for you guys. It's an open question. I would just like to get an idea of your individual perspectives from your respective parts of the world. In a nutshell, why are you joining this conversation on research and climate intervention, and why should other people be joining in that conversation alongside you guys as well? I don't know, Nishad, would you like to kick things off?
Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Kelly, and my fellow panelists here. Apologize I could not join in person, so glad to join virtually and to give my comments on the intervention of youth working on technological interventions for climate action. So as such, from the MENA region in the Middle East, quite a lot of technological interventions are required, given most of the most vulnerable region in the world in terms of climate change. It requires a lot of support from technological perspective to make the right direction, moving away to decarbonization, and also going net zero. So most of the countries in the region believes in technological support in transition from pro-fossil fuel industries towards a more greener economy. And if you check in the past, countries like UAE, Saudi Arabia have already looked into those technology. At the same time, they feel those sort of interventions would definitely help moving away in some of the impacts of climate change that would affect them, especially in terms of water. So rain is something very scarce in our part of the world, and you might have seen this impacts the weather, temperature, as well as vegetation as such. So I believe there lies a lot of scope for in this part of the world due to this extreme weather phenomena we are already facing, plus the impacts of climate change is making it worse. So as such, a person from the region, I believe such sort of technology would be an ideal, but of course there are counter arguments too, but of course we have to work in tandem, in collaboration with other institutions and other countries, because it is not just one country would be doing, the impacts would be cross-border as well. So having a united regional perspective or collaboration or partnership would be something that would definitely help in such cases. So I see a lot of scope in the coming years. A lot of interventions have been happening lately in terms of such support for technology for making some of the changes in the weather that would definitely down the temperature in this part of the world. So my bottom line is that the sort of technology is something most of the countries in this part of the world looking at, because the change cannot happen without such technological intervention. So I feel there has to be more scope of study and research, and more funding also available for such research and development. And I see this would definitely help in taking forward.
Thank you so much. And I mean, Ricardo, what is your take? Is it similar, aligned, not at all? What is the reason you're joining the conversation today?
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be in such a distinguished panel. And hi, Nishat. I'm going to ask if maybe I could put a little animation. I should be getting it here. I don't want to take you off, Nishat. I'll just take you off for a second. But I'll be getting into context. And it's because I come from the world's most climate vulnerable country, according to the Climate Vulnerability Index. And this is Honduras. What you're seeing is the community of Cedeño, just a 2-hour drive from my house, which has been experiencing sea level rise since before I was born. This was 1990, a hurricane, 2004, with increasing sea level. And what you're seeing in this very simple animation is just blocks of houses, blocks of restaurants, of bars, of hotels that are now under the sea in my country, Honduras. So to me, it's very simple to talk about climate intervention because we need this. We need solutions, and we need them now. I know that coming and flying so far, perhaps it's very difficult to perceive what climate change really is, and it's sometimes seen as something that is going to come on the long term, or it's going to be something on 2050, or it might someday happen to us. But in Honduras, it's already happening. It's been happening for quite a couple of years now. And unfortunately, it's really changing the way that many of my fellow countrymen have to deal with life. So we are only causing a mere 0.03% of global emissions. I'm currently working on my national strategy, on my country's national decarbonization plan. Don't get me wrong, I love my job. Don't tell this to my boss, but it's a little bit of a slap in the face for us to actually start talking about reducing emissions when we're clearly not the ones that are causing climate change. So what do we need? We need solutions. And we need solutions that are scalable, that are easily deployable, and that will, in the end, save the lives of thousands of people that are in the front line, in the most pressing risks of what climate change is, which is the largest threat and challenge that humanity has ever faced. So just to conclude in that sense, I think that climate intervention is something that needs to be supported, at least needs to be understood better. And I always think about how many plans do we actually have to address climate change. We only have mitigation or reducing emission as plan A, adaptation as plan B. I don't like talking too much about adaptation in my country because it's not like we're going to build a Venice on these types of cities, right? It's not so simple, especially because we don't have the funds for that. And then a plan C involves on inventing some machines to extract carbons. We need things that are more scalable and in the end that will save the lives of many that are, well, just as I said, that are reaching the biggest and the most devastating impacts on climate change. And it's more than just climate, and I'll close with that. It's more than just a flood from now and then. It's more than a heavy rain. It's more than a hurricane that might come in a year or two. It's actually all that comes with it, the migration, the inequality, the destruction, the losing of houses. I come from what was known as one of the safest countries in the world, and after having a devastating hurricane, we're now one of the most violent countries, and a lot of it was because many of these people lost their houses, lost their incomes, and they are desperate to survive. So that is my perception of this. This is why I am pushing for so big solutions, and well, I'll be happy to be speaking more about this on the panel. But thank you, Maddie, and thank you everyone that is here.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, for sharing that. Just helps us to really empathize with that situation, which we can feel sometimes so shut off from in our part of the world, in Glasgow and Europe and etc. Josh, what about yourself? Can you share why you're joining this conversation today?
He stole my words. Literally. He took everything. Good to see you, Nishat. He stole my words, literally. What I'm going to add is that, look, we're talking about keeping 1.5 alive, and that's what everything in there is about, right? COP26, keeping 1.5 alive, that is important. We need to do that. But some countries have already seen 1 degree already. right? Some are already getting to 2 degrees. And the commitment currently is still aiming at 2.4. Before we came to COP, it was at 2.7. With all the pledges and pledges and pledges, we still at it was 2.7, now we're still at 2.4. So keeping 1.5 alive is already difficult. We know that adaptation is important, and we need the finance, and I really am a big fan of adaptation because Africa needs adaptation. People need to be able to build resilience to the impact of climate change, which they see every day, and that takes resources. Developing countries alone need 70 billion to adapt. Adaptation got its biggest funding ever at COP26, $232.6 million or so dollars, not even up to $1 billion, and we need 70 billion to adapt. So the money is not coming in to adapt. At the same time, emissions are still on the rise. Mm-hmm. So the impacts are going to come, and I have a background in disaster management, so we're seeing frequent disasters or frequent climate hazards, but also much more intense. And if I look at the young people I work with, and I always use Mozambique and Cyclone Idai as a good example, so as young people living in a community, Cyclone Idai came, took everything down, you start to rebuild. Just before you could even finish rebuilding, another cyclone hits, everything goes down again. So you spend 3 years of rebuilding. Now think about that and imagine that. If you spend 3 years of your life just in rebuilding phase, your whole future is taken away from you literally, because you've lost 3 good years just thinking of rebuilding. Now think of the anxiety that comes along with, and think about what possible future you could have. You live in fear because you think in the next time there's no point in rebuilding anymore, because the next time is going to come again and everything could be down. So in that sense, for me, it's very important that we start thinking around new solutions and how to reduce emissions as fast as possible. And that is very important. Just transition is needed, resilience is needed, but we are slow. This is the plain truth. We are slow. We all agree that we need to do these things, but we are slow. And hence, research into new solutions are important. And one question I have is, this sounds fantastic, and I like Sarah for explaining all of that to that, but I think a lot of questions young people have, and sort of the back and forth around this, which is also something we'll talk about later, is that what could go wrong? It sounds like a fantastic solution, and it could help, but there's also fear of what could go wrong. Mm-hmm. And a lot more young people think from a very holistic view now, okay, we don't want to do solution A, and then next year we have another problem which we need to find another solution for. Mm-hmm. So you might want to think around what could go wrong, but if it's really could be a solution that really help us reduce emissions as fast as possible, that is something worth looking into, because for near-term risk over the next few years, Africa needs that, right? Because we need to stop the disasters from coming, we need to stop the hazards from manifesting into disasters, and that is very important. And that's my take on this. Yeah.
Thank you, Josh. So again, more people on the front lines facing these kinds of threats. They're already dealing with them for years gone by. So yeah, thank you, Josh, for sharing that. Could not have said it better myself, absolutely. Beatrice, yourself, why are you coming here today to come to this panel and join in the conversation on research and climate intervention?
Well, in Paris, we're not in the front line like you guys could have talked about before. But I feel like it's really important to come and discuss about climate intervention, especially when I see that, well, we all know now that we are not reducing emissions enough. So we need like other kind of solution to buy us some time. And even if I'm not directly confronted to the effects you can see, for example, Ricardo, what you showed us, I'm involved in Youngo, and through that I can speak to a lot of young people coming from all over the world, and so I'm confronted through their speech and what they've been saying, and through their involvement in Youngo, what do they need now. And I also have this engineer background, so of course technological solution might interest me, but I mean we should not. It's important to open to other people, because we always think that maybe climate intervention are too specific and it's only like really for people with that scientific background, but it's not, because we need to have a lot of young people, including the governance of those technologies. And yeah, and so I really want to emphasize that young people should really take this subject and try to think about it and how we can make it, we can have an inclusive governance of it, because I can see that it's so difficult to have young people included in the decision-making process for such important decisions that could change our future and that could bring solutions. So, for example, I'm involved in some negotiations at the COP, and I can see how it can be difficult for some countries and some parties to take young people seriously. Like literally this morning or a bit earlier, one representative of the country was saying that we made cute interventions, and I was like, how can you say it? Like, we're not just cute people saying cute things.
You're 25, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm 25 and I'm an engineer, and I've worked for 2 years or 3 years, and now I'm taking another master degree in political science. And we spoke, and they were like, oh, you make cute interventions, but we cannot understand what you could bring to the conversation, really. And I'm like, okay, so we're really far away from what we could expect regarding like solutions we can have and including people into that, and youth especially.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I guess there's a greater need to have more eyes on this, especially from our generation, considering the attitudes we're faced with as young people. It's even more important because we're being actively shut out.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for sharing that. I guess that brings me on to the second question, and that's about the youth call to action on climate intervention. So just a little bit of context about this. This is the world's first ever policy document profiling young people's demands on research and dialogue regarding climate intervention. We officially published it last week on SilverLining's website. And this is the first time we are talking about it at a public event, so we're really excited to be sharing it with you guys today. So background. Earlier this year, SilverLining and Youngo TechMech, Beatrice is part of organization within Youngo, we teamed up to host the Safe Climate Youth Summit in an effort to boost dialogue and greater youth participation within this area of climate change. Josh was my co-host for that event, and also Nishad and Ricardo joined us as panelists there as well. It was the world's first ever climate intervention youth conference. And with that in mind, we wanted to develop something concrete out of it to help push us forward, which is where this was born. It is the crystallization of the output of a workshop that we held at the end of the summit, where we gathered the views of young participants on the changes they would like to see made on research and policy conversations regarding climate intervention. And then Beatrice, Ricardo, Nisha, and myself, we drafted this output into this document and established proposals under 6 categories. And those categories are guiding principles to move forward, education and awareness, research, youth cooperation and inclusion, youth agency and empowerment, and youth advocacy. So just to give perhaps an example, we can see up there. So under, for example here, guiding principles to move forward, we have number 6, equity. Prioritize establishing equitable benefit sharing mechanisms when making decisions on climate intervention, research and policy. So it's these kinds of demands. Maybe one more to the right. We've got funding up there in the corner at the top. A bit further up. Yeah, thank you. So I believe this is under research. Funding. We need greater funding for research and the means to scale this up and establish appropriate and publicly acceptable funding sources. Minimizing impact. All research must be controlled with low environmental impact and have appropriate safeguards in place to ensure this. Sarah spoke on this earlier, actually. So, wrapping that up, I was actually inspired by this document because Josh worked on a similar one with the Global Centre on Adaptation. This was run in consultation with thousands of young people. Yeah, it was a big document, and yeah, I thought it was an extremely effective idea, and so we came up with this for climate intervention. So coming to my question, I just wanted to have you guys tell us, your overall perspectives on the YCA, the Youth Call to Action. How do you think we can get started on bringing forward these proposals and implementing these changes? Nisha, do you want to kick that off?
Well, of course, like you mentioned in the document, awareness is something is very key. And I think this is one of its kind of a report that should be propagated and shared with other youth groups, also to give them the understanding of why it is necessary and how we can have more backing of science and technology to work in hand with our policy and decision makers. So I see this as a good venue for both youth, policymakers, and the research and development team to sit together and come up with more concrete action, because now many of the things are being discussed are very research-based and lab-based, other than the few cloud seeding technology which we are heard of or which has been prominently used. So I think this can be a way of taking the discussion further, one or two steps ahead, and getting it more actively. And I thank Kelly for doing that exponentially great, and great for us from the region also to supporting that sort of intervention that is required in terms to make this urgent change, how we can use technology as a means to transform in a way that is better in end of life for people, and also at the same time keeping in mind how fast we can change the current climate scenarios.
Thank you, Nishad. Thank you. And just for reference, Kelly he's referring to is Kelly Wanzer. That's our executive director. She's sitting at the back. She'll be joining us shortly. Ricardo, could you tell us?
So I might be a little bit biased because I feel like this document is my baby, so I'm going to say it's amazing, of course. But I think, just like Nisha was saying, it's a one-of-a-kind effort. We do a lot of documents, youth, even though many people think that we're only, holding up signs. No, we actually do make a lot of, participate on consultations. We do a lot of policy advising. We do a lot of these efforts. But this is the first time it was done on climate intervention. And I think this is really important because this is the first time we're actually addressing something that is not only the problem, but is a solution. And if I were to pick one of perhaps a favorite category, would be the research side, because I know that most of you might be feeling with so many doubts, so many questions. Why haven't I heard this before? What's going to happen if this goes like that, or what happens if this goes wrong? And I think that that's why research is fundamental. We need to understand better climate intervention before deploying it, before actually advocating for it, but we're advocating for that, for research. And in that sense, I think that we did a great job, not only because I was part of the team, not only because we're youth, because it's a very well-centered policy document, and I'm really hoping that it'll be part of the solutions, or perhaps the number of solutions that we're going to be having available towards what is the largest challenge that humanity is facing according to the United Nations, the climate crisis. So, yes.
Thanks, Ricardo. Yeah, and obviously we worked on that, so take it with it. Well, we're being honest, and Josh, what was your perspective?
I mean, I didn't get the chance to work on it as you did, so I'm not going to be biased or anything. I'm just going to say what I think. First of all, I think it's a great document because it outlines some of the things I find very important. Diversity in research, in this kind of research, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's the kind of research that is sort of a niche, and only a few people focus on that, and it's our responsibility to make sure that this research includes a wide array of people from different backgrounds, but also with different priorities, to focus on it and to get understanding why this is important. And that includes a lot of youth engagement, a lot of awareness raising, but also getting people early on before they even sort of choose what courses to study and whatever, to say this is a possibility and this is an option, right? Something that you could do and it's still part of the fight. I know that for many young people, there's a fundamental question. Why do we spend so much trying to do this and not just reduce emissions? Right, I mean, let's just reduce emissions and we don't have to go through all this struggle. But the challenge is that the system has already been changed, right? We can work on a reversal mode, but we've not. I mean, since we started the conversation till 2021, it doesn't look like we're going to get to net zero today or tomorrow. The years keep changing. 2030, now some say 2040, some say 2050. I don't know when that's going to happen. So at some point, we have to realize that we need to have a constructive conversation, which is part of the document, as you mentioned, it's the principles of engagement, constructive conversation. I think that is very, very important that we work on this document, get more young people involved from different backgrounds, get constructive conversation around where are we, let's be realistic with the situation, let's acknowledge what we can do, and let's acknowledge what we need to expedite as early as possible. And technologies like this, and this is research, and for everything we know in this world and everything we use in our daily lives, came out of some sort of research. Things don't fall from the sky. You invest, you fail, you find a solution the next time. If you're lucky, you find it on the first try. If you're not, you try, and then, And we know so many stories that we read and we believe in and we take as inspiration. Never give up, never fail, try. And, I mean, we look at this crisis, we need to try different solutions, and this is one of them. And we need to get a lot more young people to perceive it that way, look at it that way, and get an interest to dig into it and find other options. Because if the solutions actually were present and absolute, we shouldn't be here. It's because there's still a lot of different layers to the problem, and we need different sort of interventions to dig into it. So this is my take, and in terms of taking it forward, of course, this has to feed into some sort of a policy process. If I'm looking at COP, for instance, which means that Beatrice for the tech MEC, and of course for the work that the CTCN, which I forgot the full name, but sort of the arm for the UNFCCC on climate technology. This is something that we could approach them on and say, look, this is something that we're considering. How do we get more young people to look into climate technologies like this and interventions like this? How does that get to be put forward by young negotiators as something that could be considered and fitting it into the policy process? But also, of course, engaging with private sector. Say this is something that we could look into, and this is something worth investing in, because research is expensive, and it requires the resources, particularly if you want to get new people to be interested in the new research field. It means that more internship opportunities, more fellowship grants to get people to start learning, and also being deliberate about it, making sure that picking people from different backgrounds. That's my favorite part of this document, is the diversity in research. Very, very important. So that's my take on it, and really congrats for such an amazing work. Yeah.
Thank you. Well received. Thank you very much. Just one thing you mentioned that I absolutely agree with you on is the need to kind of almost get in there early in the conversation with this kind of topic, because I think it can really trigger a lot of backlash and a lot of skepticism. But once you have those kind of conversations early, presenting the research that's already there, but then make it a case of research, then we can really go somewhere. And the guiding principles to move forward is my favorite category, because we can only move forward on this topic under shared values. I think it's really something that needs that absolutely to make progress. So yeah, thank you again, Josh. And Beatrice, would you like to share with us your reflections?
Yeah, but I think we lost Nisha, right?
Could we get Nisha back up?
Yeah, so what I think of all this document, it's a good start, because as you said, there are not enough intervention or communication about climate intervention and research on climate intervention. Like you said, you're the only event in Glasgow doing that and talking about research on climate intervention. So it shows how much people are not yet willing to talk about it. And I think it's maybe a mistake, because it could be a part of the solution. But I also I also think that if we're not talking about it, it's maybe because people are scared, but it's a vicious circle, because they are scared, so they don't want to talk about it, but then they don't talk about it, so they are scared. So I think that we need to bring this kind of document forward, and research on climate intervention. We need to maybe reassure people in the first place, saying that this is not becoming the plan A. The plan A is still reducing emissions, and this is not a way to do a kind of greenwashing, or to say that we saved our planet, you can keep polluting, it's okay. It's really important to say that, because I know a lot of people who are just scared about climate technologies just because of that. Just because they think that it's gonna focus on the debates only on climate intervention, and then people are just gonna forget about reducing emissions in the first place. So this would be my point of view and advice about how to bring this forward. And since everyone said his favorite part, it would be governance for me, but I mentioned it earlier because it's really it's really one of the most important points, which will allow us to communicate more about it and to involve more people in it, and to make these people less scared about it, to have a good governance. And it will be also a way to have this kind of intergenerational justice, to involve more young people, and to also involve other parts who are not really represented, like women and gender, and indigenous people, and so
Thank you so much. And I completely agree, and governance is of course a key aspect of this subject, and we do try to address that in the document, but also don't forget that this was the output of a workshop with several young people beyond ourselves who all kind of put these ideas forward, and they were from all over the world, from Nepal, Pakistan, the small island states. There was a girl from Kiribati. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to bring to the stage Kelly Wanzer, our executive director, to get a bit of a dialogue going. Unfortunately, Penny and Marcos, who were supposed to join us here today, they're Tongan and Ecuadorian delegates. They had some last-minute negotiations to attend to, so we just have Kelly, but we're extremely pleased to have her with us today. She has done a lot in bringing this conversation to the fore and promoting greater inclusion of vulnerable groups, including marginalised groups as well, like young people, to the Climate Intervention Dialogue. Tiny bit of background, she has also helped develop climate research and policy in the US quite extensively. She served as a reviewer for the IPCC, NSTC, and NOAA in the States. She's also launched a research fund with SilverLining. She co-founded and currently serves as senior advisor to the Marine Cloud Brightening Project, which Sarah talked about earlier with us today. And she also serves as a board director of Dendra Systems, which is a company that uses advanced technologies to restore ecosystems. And lastly, she's also a member of the President's Circle of the National Academy of Sciences. So a very distinguished guest with us today. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us. I wanted to just ask you, what are your reflections on what has been shared with us today by our youth panelists?
Well, thank you, Maddie, and thank you, panel. And I have a few reflections. My favorite thing about this session, this dialogue, this panel, is that I got to sit in the back and listen. And I am, impressed. I'm honored. I'm fascinated by what you have to say. And so for me, one of the critical things, or one of the things that I've learned in getting to know this network of young climate leaders is how valuable your perspectives are, how sophisticated your understanding is, and how valuable it is to us to have you at the table. And now I will say, because I come from the technology sector originally, and I spent a lot of my career in Silicon Valley. And so the attitude about the value of young people there is quite different. So we tend to think young people sort of hold the secret sauce to where the world is going in some ways. And so I've been a little bit surprised and disappointed that young people are not more natively part of the process, and especially around topics of technology, innovation. And the other perspective that I have, well, I'll share a couple perspectives on the document, but one of the things that struck me about getting to know you and the way that you work is you are networked globally as peers already. In a way that my generation doesn't do naturally, in my experience. And so that diversity emphasis and your comfort level with this kind of dialogue, to me, that's a differentiator in your generation that we need badly. You guys work that way, you enjoy working that way, you know how. And so I think that that's a wonderful aspect of what you do. And so my reaction as far as the youth call to action is also that I'm thanking you, because the development of that document, we in my organization learned some things from you. That that was part of a process that you guys brought to the table. All we did was help you get together. So your document sort of supersedes many of the things that we've seen around climate intervention in terms of what it walks through and how to think about it. So I really appreciate you guys developing that as a contribution to the category, and I hope people take it seriously.
Thank you so much. You're really flattering us with that one. Do you guys have any responses to that? I particularly maybe wanted to draw on, have you found that older people in this climate space struggle to interact with, or in the same capacity that young people can within the climate change policy dialogues, for example? Nishad, do you have a response? I saw you nodding your head, I wasn't sure.
No, well, it's sometimes difficult. I appreciate how Kelly looked at this and brought this young people who she said naturally networking, unlike what she finds in the Silicon Valley young people. That's a good comparison she gave. Mm-hmm. That's itself shows how much she foresee that this sort of interventions or discussions has to go deep, and it has to come from the new generation to bring up that conversation, comfortable or non-comfortable discussions with the peers. Of course, it is necessary. So I think this opens up a lot of avenues for us, like young people, to ask like much larger questions and have that discussion, because most of us are very career-oriented, have a very good background in engineering or policy. So it gives us a right fit to take this conversation further.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So in response to that, actually, does anyone from the audience have something to add? We've got a lot of young people in the room, a lot of older people in the room. We have someone at the back.
Thanks. So this is a question to those who come from climate vulnerable countries and experience climate change right now. So with geoengineering, just to use that term in what climate intervention is, why put all your, or not all, but a lot of your eggs in that basket? And considering it is like the large-scale manipulation of Earth, like there's so much in communities around the world, local adaptation solutions, the way that we scale down fossil fuel, the geopolitics that come with it. Like, why aren't we focusing on that? There's so much money to go to those countries. Like, why is this something that's to be considered? It's so risky. It's like, even to deploy this technology, it requires setting up treaties, it requires denouncing the CBD moratorium, it requires setting up governance under current geopolitical systems. And we know what those power dynamics are like. We know how this escalates, we know how power compounds, we know how power dynamics work. So why this is what I want to say. And I have that question to you first in respect that you come from climate vulnerable countries and you know the situation are very different to us here in the global north. There was one correction that I wanted to make, and it was that there is a climate geoengineering workshop in the Indigenous Pavilion by the Indigenous Environment Network, and that was on yesterday. And that was Indigenous peoples presenting their perspectives and cosmovisions against climate geoengineering because of the fundamental value of manipulating with nature to this large scale. So I wanted to ask you that first. And then second of all, under the principle of constructive dialogue and inclusion, I have a statement to read out that brings perspectives in that are certainly opposed to those in the room. And it's important that they are here too. So I'm going to let you answer first, and then I'm going to respond.
Thank you. I'll be happy to take that question first. And it's important to be clear about what we're advocating for. I can definitely give you my perspective on that. We're advocating for more research first. We're not advocating, or at least I'm not advocating for anything that is not known, that is not fully comprehended, that is not applicable, that might have side effects. I'm not looking for, the vaccine is a good way to look at it. It does have to go through a process, through a very important process, and what I am advocating for is for it to actually undertake that process and to be taken seriously. Why, you were asking me, and I'll be happy to address that as well, is all these solutions you were talking about, I work on them too. I'm a climate negotiator. Those are for 2050. I don't have the face to tell these people that I was just showing in the video that this is just going to get worse and worse for them for the next 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 to 30 years. And even when we get there, we're not really sure if we are actually going to control climate change. We're probably going to make over 1.5. And even then, climate change is still going to be, CO2 is still going to be up in the air. It's still not going to be a good solution for them. So for me, it's a way about how can we get more solutions to the table. If it's not a solution, fine. But at least we had research behind it. At least we moved behind it. At least we had more thought, more resources, and at least we are addressing it from different perspectives. So it's not about implementing today for me or tomorrow. It's about advocating for more research and more perspective.
Let me quickly add to that, and I'll allow you to comment. I think the first thing I would like to say is that, first of all, we don't have that basket in the first place. You said we put in all our hope in that basket. That basket is not there. It doesn't exist, right? The basket that exists for us now, adaptation and resilience. And this is what is happening at COP. This is the build-up all the way through COP. Most vulnerable countries need to adapt. They need to build resilience. Why? Because we know for sure the impacts are coming and we cannot escape it. So that is very important to note. And that is what we put in our hope in. In terms of power dynamics and the politics and all of that, that is what got us into this mess in the first place, right? I mean, it's the same power dynamics that allow countries to pollute and not take responsibility for it. Where is loss and damage? Loss and damage is being talked about. Countries need their money to be able to get out of that. They need to be compensated. It's still being negotiated. It's not there yet because of the power dynamics. This is the same process that is going on there. So this is a process that I wish we could eliminate all of that, and countries will have the virtues to say that, you know what, I am responsible for this, and I'm going to put forward for that. At the United Nations University where I did my studies, one of our professors, Professor Dieck, made a proposal. What about climate passports, right? That is another option. What if that countries in the Pacific that are losing their lands, losing their sort of riskscapes, which is the landscape where they know and they live with, when they lose that, could they just migrate to another country that has caused a lot of pollution and put them in that mess? But no, politics is blocking that, right? No, negotiations do not make that possible. So this is a system we cannot necessarily wake up one morning and get rid of. It is what is there now. So if there is a process working through that same system that allows to reduce emission, and like I said, some say 2030, some say 2040, some say 2050. I don't know when we're going to reach net zero. And even if we reach net zero, that does not change the cyclones that are coming the floods that are coming, the droughts that are coming, they are there today, they are there tomorrow. It doesn't change that. So for me, really, the angle is options, multiple options, how to deploy that options. And like I said before, most of the concerns that I hear, and sort of not speaking for myself, but for a representative group of young people, is that how do we deploy solutions today such that they do not cause other impacts to us in the future? And that is very fundamental in every solution that we're going to deploy. And this is why things like the carbon development mechanism has been very advocated against a lot over there with double counting and different timelines, because young people are very scared that if a country A pays money to country B and say, okay, we're going to pay you a lot of money, so you offset, but we can pollute, we know that's a problem, right? And we're not going to support that. But it is an option that was there, that was negotiated. Countries were already practicing that. But again, young people thinking of sort of intergenerational equity, we know that our future will be at risk if countries just pay money and just mess up. So we're not going to support that. But knowing that these are the options, and some of them already in documents and being implemented, we need to advocate against that. For if new solutions are going to come up like this one, focusing on sort of marine climate brightening, having the possibility of reducing emissions significantly, this is not going to eliminate the fact that we're going to make sure that this process does not cause sort of any damage in the future. That is still a fundamental principle that would apply to any solution. But let's be honest here. The politics, the power dynamics, they are there. We cannot sort of get rid of that. We can call it out. We can call for political changes. And I think a lot more young people are doing that. But we still need to go through that process as long as they exist now to find solutions that work for those who are drowning now, for those who are in the floods now. And I agree with Ricardo. I mean, it's difficult to look in the face to someone and tell them, oh, next 5 years, everything will be better. I mean, it will be a lie. It's not going to be unless there are significant changes. And even with that, we still need really solutions to get people out of that mess.
And just to touch on like geoengineering at whole, because you were talking about marine cloud brightening, like what about stratospheric aerosol injection, which is mimicking volcanic eruptions on, like a yearly basis? It could be a small amount of like 1 ton to even 20 tons of sulfite particles. Like thinking about the scale of that and the potential consequences of that comes under climate intervention. And this is something that you are promoting to be researched. Like it's just so far from fact and actually being something that we can have global consensus of. And it really comes down to the fundamental value that we should not be manipulating nature to that scale. And it's the slippery slope of you support marine cloud brightening, you then start supporting ScopeX, and then what else do you start supporting as the issue gets worse and worse and worse? And with research, the amount of money that goes into research, not only research, but the resources for research, the equipment for research, that money, is that the best place, we could be spending this money instead of actually researching real solutions to be deployed that are being researched in Global South communities around the world, being led by Indigenous people? There's a huge block and just the wrong divestment of money, I feel. And I really wanted to read out this statement, so I really wish that you
could I address her questions first?
I'm going to read out the statement, but I would like to speak to the climate vulnerable, those from climate vulnerable regions only.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, we youth from around the world bring attention to disingenuous tactics to promote geoengineering that make this youth call to action lack legitimacy. SilverLining, when they collaborated with Younger, falsely represented that this event was in collaboration with Younger. This is not the truth. We, like-minded youth, denounce this tactic to portray validity for geoengineering by associating influential youth groups through false means. The Youth Call to Action and its organisational convenes removed a participant from the June summit after sharing Indigenous perspectives and open letters by the Sami community who rejected testing on their lands. We denounce this tactic to remove critical voices, diverse worldviews, and justice-based frameworks from the discussion. The Youth Call to Action and SilverLining have also reportedly tokenised youth from the Global South by inviting them to present on the direness of the climate crisis without explaining clearly what geoengineering is and how they are advancing the research of solar radiation management, including stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening. We notice this tactic of intentional vagueness through the wording climate intervention that for most youth would signify general climate action to effectively disguise the highly controversial geoengineering agenda, which a lot of youth do reject. We notice that the youth involved who were involved in the June summit have explicitly demanded to be fully dissociated from the process in their frustration of being misled. This statement is supported by like-minded youth grounded in the historical work and practice by the Global South, Indigenous communities and marginalised folks who do not lose faith in the real solutions and the real ability to cut fossil fuel emissions to zero as our only option.
Thank you very much, and I'll quickly react to that if I may, sorry, to Karin. Look, I agree, right? I mean, I agree to everything we've read, right? Like I said before, why don't we just slash emissions? This is what we need to do. But let me tell you a story, right? I got my house here, and you have your house here, right? You left your tap on, the water is flowing. The water comes to my house. So, Ricardo, your house is flooding because I left my tap open, and I went to work. Your house is flooding. Your house is flooding. So, when you come home, Ricardo, the first thing you're probably going to think of is, oh, my room is flooding. Let me get the most important things out of the room. That's what you're going to do immediately. Now, the next thing is, let me try to close the tap before you even start cleaning. And this is exactly what happened with climate change, right? The world realized, look, the emissions are running. We got to do something. Instead of thinking of, oh, let's get the most important things out of the place, we focus on straightly, let's go and close the tap. And we've been trying to close that tap since the conversation started, reduce emissions. And it's 2021, and it's COP26. Emissions are still flowing, right? And this is my point. Emissions are still flowing, and they are not getting down. And the stuff in the room are still flooded, right? If there's a baby in the room, the baby is flooded. Whatever property you have in that room, that is getting sunk in there. So that is very important. And we need to take care of that. And this is where loss and damage comes in. This is where adaptation comes in, and we need finance for that. And this is what most of the conversation for most vulnerable countries have been focusing on. Let's deploy the resource, A, to adapt, to build resilience, and to get people to safety. Secondly, let's reduce emissions. And let's get to that net zero, which everyone is promising. And like I said, we are not there yet, unfortunately. And with everything that has been promised, and real solutions as young people are calling for, and we are equally young people, those real solutions, where are they? Right? Where are they? And if they were there, with all that negotiation, we still aim, and the target is now 2.4 degrees, and that would be disastrous. With already 1.0, Somalia is getting central west floods, and that is chaotic. And if you look at even countries like Ghana, where we just have 1.0 warming, I mean, years of development has been taken away with floods coming in. So we're not saying that, and here I'm going to be very specific. We started with Sarah giving us a background on the research that she's doing, and Jessica came in with what they're going to do, right? If there are any concerns about that, and like I said, I'm very interested in knowing what could go wrong. So those are questions we need to ask them, what could go wrong? But we're not preventing people from having this conversation. And I think if there's any deliberate effort to not start this conversation, you probably wouldn't be here, right? Because you're an advocate that these solutions could be problematic. But that is my question. We need to ask what could go wrong, how do we mitigate that risk, and how do we make sure that we focus on reducing emissions and getting people to safety. And I really wish money would be spent the way we want it to be spent. Because I get frustrated when I see a lot of private sector investment coming to Africa, thinking about flying drones to deliver medical supplies, right? Just get the roads done, get the ambulance there. We know that work. We know that's going to deliver the supplies. But yes, let's do drones. Why? Because we need to think of the unforeseeable. At some point, this technology might be useful. So let's do research into it. Let's get it documented. And I wish that would not be the case. But this is the thinking. You plan. Different options being available. So I want you to have that confidence that it's not, and I repeat to you in this case, this solution is not being deployed today. It's not like, something amazing is just going to happen and all of a sudden we get to net zero. That's not what's going to happen. But the same way that we started the climate conversation with mitigation, carbon offsetting, all of that, and now we go to adaptation. Realizing very well that the offsetting is not working, the mitigation is not getting as fast as we want it to be, and countries need to get to safety, let's start talking about adaptation. And then we went to the point where we said, okay, loss and damage finance, because clearly some islands are getting lost and they are missing, and those people need safety. And those are the options we're talking about. We cannot just put all our eggs, in mitigation, because that's what we'll be doing if we neglect everything. We will say that, countries will mitigate, the global north will mitigate, and Africa will be fine, and Latin America and South Asia will be fine, and there'll be no flooding, and they're going to be okay. But unfortunately, they are not. So let's work together, constructive dialogue, and I'm really happy that you brought these things up so that we can address them. But I think some of the key questions we need to ask the scientists in the lab, what they're cooking up in the lab, and what are the risks that are along those lines, and how we can mitigate that. But let's put our focus on the main goal, human security and safety. That is what we're all aiming for.
And also, about what you mentioned with the process with the climate summit, with the participant being removed, I would absolutely love to have a conversation about that and let's have a talk about what happened, because I think there's been a miscommunication there, and I truly believe we can move past that and resolve that. So please, if you would like to stay at the end, please stay for a conversation about that. But yeah, thank you so much, Josh. And yes, at the back.
Thank you very much. Just a short question, because the baby is waking up. So I said a bit earlier that all models are wrong, but they're still useful. And the models show at this moment that what geoengineering will do is that it will change the climate system fundamentally. It won't bring it back to what we had before. It will change it. So isn't it naive? You know the global power relations today. That's what you have been mentioning, and you've been mentioning that that's the reason that you're actually hoping that geoengineering might bring a solution. But given these global power relations, don't you think it's very naive to assume that geoengineering will be deployed in a way that favors your countries? I'm quite sure that geoengineering will be deployed in a way that favors the Western Northern countries, and that the situation in your countries will get worse.
I wonder if, Kelly, do you think you could speak to perhaps the modeling part of that
Well, I can
question?
speak to the science question with that, and I'll let you guys speak a little bit to the global policy question. But from a scientific perspective, Sarah touched on it, the climate system is highly mixed. And so one of the questions that comes up about climate interventions is whether it can be optimized for certain people or certain regions. But generally speaking, what scientists have found so far, and we had a climate modeling session this morning, is that these techniques might be useful in terms of the sort of global heat concentrations. But it's a really hard problem to try to address the climate only in your part of the world. That's why localized solutions are less likely to be helpful, because it's like the lump in the bed problem or the finger in the dike problem, heat moves around. So what tends to happen when you put aerosols in the atmosphere, and to the question earlier, there are masses of aerosols in the atmosphere today from pollution that are cooling the planet. That's what Sarah was getting at. So a form of this is happening, and it's happening in ways that we don't understand very well. And so what appears to happen in the models when you do this and you reduce the global average concentration of heat is the extremes go down. And so it's really about those climate extremes that we're seeing and the opportunity to decrease them in ways that help keep people safer. But that's the question for study. And to your point, so from a policy perspective, we did some work on this with international climate lawyers. That is the key question, is can you study what the safety profile is, kind of like Ricardo's point with respect to medicine. And that's what the research would be aimed at, is to try to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for clarifying. Also, please have that, Kelly, you can talk about that directly with you as well if you'd like to know more. And to the policy half of that question, do you guys have a response?
So yes, maybe I can touch a little bit upon that. I think it's a funny question, I would say, if we relate it to vaccines. I had to trust the global north for vaccines. I don't know if they put a chip on it. I don't know if I am transmitting 5G network. I don't know if I'm going to explode someday. But they were definitely not manufactured nor researched in Honduras. I don't think in Ghana either. It was part of the global north. So what am I advocating for? Again, I'm advocating for research. And that's what's worrying me a little bit about these conversations, is that I know there is a lot of doubt of implementation. Please let me be in agreement with you. I am also in a lot of doubt about implementation. I am convinced we're not there yet. But I think it's very, very, very difficult, and it is very dangerous to try to hinder and to try to stop research. This is all what it's about. I'm here just advocating for science. I'm just here advocating for more ways, and research is not only about the technological aspect, it's also about what will happen socially, what will happen to those communities like my community. What would happen in the policy side? How could we actually work with this well? How can we build narratives? Once again, and just going back to all of this, is that we only have 3 ways to address the largest crisis in humanity. We should be having a plan Z, a plan Z on this. So I think that research is what we need, and that's why I'm here today. I don't think I'm here as a token or as a poster child. I don't feel used. I am very convinced that what we need is more research towards knowing better what we can do and what could happen in all aspects of society. So thank you.
Just to jump in.
Yes, Nisha, go ahead.
Just echoing what Joshua and Ricardo mentioned. I mean, as I started in the conversation, these are the first 1-2 steps. I don't know if you recall those lines. Is that we need research, and one of the key asks by the vulnerable countries, including like the countries who are disappearing out of this earth, are asking for what technology we can help to move faster towards what Joshua is, not 2.5, 1.5. Well, the keyest thing is to reduce emissions. That is the bottom line. There is no discussion on that too. So, for example, like I would explain, there are a lot of cloud seeding happening in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries. Why? Because we don't have rain. We don't have natural vegetation as such. Yes, the temperature change has been making it extremely difficult. So if you ask me how successful has been the cloud seeding, to a good extent, it has shown positive impacts. At the same time, negative impacts been studied because of the cloud seeding. The rain was brought in the Gulf countries, in some of the Gulf countries, but it had some side effects in the neighboring country. That has been studied. So this sort of thing is not a one-time end, and we all young people are endorsing something which we don't understand. We absolutely understand. And as a science student myself, with my background in energy and environment, I did study some of these key things and the challenges associated with that. If we don't try, we don't understand what's that in the real world. Maybe lab shows amazing results, but you don't put it on in the natural ecosystem and try on that, you don't understand. Maybe it can be pulled out if it is showing extremely different reaction to what it is expected. So as we young people, when we put up this document, the idea was to how we can take the conversation further. Like the conversation we are now having is what we are looking at. The pros and cons and what we can take it further. If we leave it only to the engineering team and in the lab and they just tried extensively on the nature, we know there might be some side effects. So we here are not only challenging, but also accepting the realities that technological intervention is required. Let's not go into the modalities of the words used, or, nobody is here washing, like the greenwashing. At least we are honest to what the technology are using, and we know the side effects are there, and we have to study better. So let's keep the conversation going, and the side effects and impacts has to be studied for without any cost. And this is why I as a person, an individual, in the organization is here, because we feel technology is key, and our part of the world is a super example of why we need such quick solution, because of the dry land we live in, and the water we are using are getting depleted at the fastest rate than anywhere else in the world.
Thank you, Nishad. Beatrice.
Yeah, also if I can. So I just wanted to say that we are, just to echo what have been said, that we are here to talk about research and not deploying these technologies. And also I think that it's important to talk about it, even if we don't agree with it. I mean, I have also doubts, and I don't say let's deploy it tomorrow. We are here to talk about research. And it's even more important because 3 weeks or 4 weeks earlier, I was at a summit called the Arctic Cycle Assembly, and there was also a topic about climate technology and solar radiation modification, especially. But it was more stratospheric, so it was a stratospheric aerosol injection. And so I had the opportunity to talk with some scientists, and I realized that this is already going on, and tomorrow you might have some governments who would like to deploy it large scale, and you will not, and people from all over the world will have never heard about it before, and they will not have a place to say what they think about it, and so we cannot just ignore it, because you have already researched on it, not enough, and you might have one day, maybe like in a year or in 10 years, some government, some countries decided to implement it large scale. And so this is what we want to prevent here. We want to have more research before that happens, so we can also monitor the risk before someone deploys large scale. And this is why we are here today. We're not saying that we need to deploy it tomorrow, and we are not saying neither that this is the only solution. The solution is to reduce emission, but we also need other solutions, since we are not reducing emission in a way enough. So we also need nature-based solution, but we need really a lot of solution here, like just not only one. And so it's really important, just to answer about is this naive? I don't think we have the time to think about whether a solution is naive or not. If it can be a solution, then we should just make research about it. So yeah, that was my point, basically.
Yeah, thank you, Beatrice. Do you want to follow up your question?
I just wanted to answer.
Yep, sure.
No, I just wanted to say that there is actually quite a lot of research that shows, I'm a researcher myself, that shows that when a technology is researched, it will very often also be deployed. So I think you can't just distinguish both so clearly, and definitely in the case of geoengineering, that's what I mentioned earlier, actually you're deploying it by researching it, because otherwise you can't study the effects if you don't deploy it. And there's only one Earth. That's a very different situation from many other research interventions. So I think that's very important to know. The second thing is, as an answer to what Kelly said, like what matters to us human beings is not global temperature. That might sound a bit strange in the context of a conference on climate change, but what matters to is our local weather phenomena. The question is, what is the effect of geoengineering on that? So it might reduce, that's what you mentioned, Kelly, it might reduce, might reduce the global temperature, but if it at the same time leads to worse weather conditions at places around the world, like a lot of rainfall on one particular place, or a lot of much more drier conditions at another place, then it leads to worse conditions than we had. So we're messing up the climate system, and that's a very, very dangerous game to play, and we've only one Earth, so we can try it once, but if it fails, there is no way back anymore. So I think we should be very aware about the very risky game you're playing, and the argument of doing research is not the innocent one. It's one that might lead to deployment.
So,
thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and you did raise an important point, because there is a reality that I'm sympathetic to, about the evolution of technology. Some people call it technology lock-in, or you start down a path and you go down that path. There are a couple of characteristics, and I'll say from a SilverLining perspective, because our position is that we don't actually know yet what we need to know about to make decisions about these things. And so, but Beatrice's point is a really important one, because we're heading into a place where some parts of the world, they don't have options. In the current IPCC projections, people are displaced. And so people will be looking for answers. People will be looking for different types of solutions. The way we think about it is for these questions, we want them to be in the open science. Sarah Doherty, who talked about marine cloud brightening, she's part of the scientific assessment panel for the ozone assessment, which looks at the safety of the ozone layer. And one of the reasons that the Montreal Protocol that protects the ozone layer is so successful is because it's incredibly science-based, and it's incredibly focused on the evidence about what is actually happening to the ozone layer and holding people to account if they are releasing the chemicals that will damage it. And so to the extent that these things ever come into play, that's the model we'd like to see, where the world has the data and people in the global south have the data, and they're looking at it for themselves and saying, you know, what situation is better where I am? Because under warming, it's hard to be worse in some parts of the world, really hard. And so what we're kind of saying that's really salient to Beatrice's point is there's a reasonably high likelihood that people will start to look into these things. And there's a way we can do that that is really open and robust and allows scientists in every country to look at this and advise their experts and to, you know, raise holy hell if it looks like a bad idea. And so we would rather that it proceeds that way in a really rigorous science perspective than a different way. So that's, you know, I really appreciate you guys weighing in, and I really appreciate you guys being here too. And the fact that you have these kinds of dialogues in this kind of way, like I said, I think my generation learns from you.
I'm enjoying the conversation for two reasons. I mean, there's a part of it which says, you know what, let's trust in the current system. Let's believe that people are going to reduce emission by the current trajectory, and we're going to be okay. And there's another part which says, you know what, we are sinking, we are drowning, we need all possible interventions to get to safety. Whatever be the case, we need both. You know, it's a different form of activism and different forms of solutions. We need both. I mean, after all, even adaptation and resilience, I always say that mitigation is the best adaptation. If it didn't cause the mess, we wouldn't be here to talk about it in the first place. So we need to get those emissions out. But the energy and the force that we look at it is very, very important. If we say that, this is going to change the system, and the system is already changed. For me, this is fundamental. The system is changed. We've already messed it up. And when I say that, if I'm being very explicit, developed countries have done that. That is explicit. I mean, the emission ratios for LDCs and developed countries is very clear, right? Richer countries have messed it up, and they have to take responsibility for that. We're going to spend years negotiating in there on how we're going to fix that problem. And loss and damage, like I said, is not getting anywhere yet. So should we trust in the current system, block all research, and say that, yes, whatever we have now is going to fix the problem, or should we try other technologies and other means of research to see what could reduce emissions much faster? And if there's any stronger advocacy, we should look at the things which are continuously now changing the system massively. The plastic pollution, the industrial revolution, which started many years ago and is still happening, right? Mass consumption, and all the elements which we know clearly are still changing the system. And we need to see how businesses are going to transform to address that while we think of getting or sucking away what is already up there. So there is still, as we're having this conversation, right? I mean, industries are still booming. Right? They're still producing more and more. They're still adding up to whatever emissions we had up there. If we do not close the tap and we're thinking of getting the water out of the room, that doesn't work. Because as you get the water out of the room, the tap is still on and the tap is still flowing. So priority, let's close the tap and let's get the water out of the room, or we do both. But we cannot say that, the focus would be getting the water out of the room while the tap is still on. I would prefer to channel more advocacy towards closing the tap in the first place before pumping the water out of the room. So we need to see where we channel our energy very strongly. And for me, it's very clear, right? If countries are suffering and countries are facing the disasters, my focus is countries which are emitting the most need to reduce their emissions. And there's so much inequalities around this, all right? I mean, let's take China, for example, right? China is known as one of the biggest polluters in the world. How many parts of the world is China producing for? And how many investments actually goes to China? And is it actually worth pointing all fingers to China? or saying that every country that is relying on China for their supplies needs to take part of that responsibility. So there's so many inequalities in play, there's so many politics in play, but, you know, we don't have time to talk about all of that. For me, the priority is countries that are at risk need the solutions and they need the support to make sure that they get to safety. If not, we're going to talk about social justice, racial justice, all sort of justice, but no matter how much effort we put into that, right, the cyclone is going to come, it's going to wash everything away. They have to start from scratch. They have to start from day one. And we cannot watch that happen. So, focus, let's close the tap, let's stop the emissions from flowing, let's get the emission out of the room, whatever means possible. But for me, that is the priority. And let's not think that the system is still in an okay state. It is changed significantly. And this is why even if we reach net zero today, we will still need to adapt and we will still need to provide enormous support. I mean, we're talking trillions of dollars of funding to communities to be able to withstand the impacts of climate change. And that is not going to go anywhere if we do not really invest and invest in technologies and research to make that possible. And it's not just this kind of research. I mean, it's different form of research. And for me, that's why I said the most important part of this document, which I like, is diversity in research, right? It's not going to be a bunch of white folks deciding this is where to go, how to go. We need to get indigenous voices as part of that research, right? We need to get local communities as part of that research, right? I mean, at the COP, the locally led adaptation principles came out, and some donors are beginning to endorse this, and this is very important because what it says is that for any adaptation measure, you need all stakeholders on an equal level deciding this is the way to go. And we need all these sort of principles applying to all forms of interventions. And this is, for me, the priority and the principles of engaging when it comes to climate risk, particularly in the short term, and how to protect and focus on human security.
Okay. Thank you so much, Josh. I think with that, we'll wrap up. And I wanted to give a massive thank you to our amazing panelists today for being there, sharing their insights and answering those key questions that you guys have posed to us. I mean, this is exactly why we're doing this kind of event. We need to have those conversations. It's absolutely critical. So thank you for posing them to us, to the panelists, and for joining us. And please, I encourage you as well to stay. We have drinks in the reception to continue this conversation where we can, really chat this out as we so should. But yes, some information if you would like to get into contact with us. Please, you can email me, tweet me. We've also got a bulletin, silverlining.ngo/youth. And also, if you would like to share the youth call to action, we have a PDF of that up on the website, which is on the sidebar of the virtual platform we're using today. Thank you again. And I hope you have a nice evening if we don't get to speak at the reception. Cheers. And thank you again, panelists.